we're going to talk about Spring and Spring Boot from a bunch of different perspectives. The next perspective I want to talk about, to kind of keep things at a fairly high level before we start diving into low-level details, are some of the software patterns that are provided or codified or applied in the context of Spring Boot. And you'll see that one of the key themes in Spring Boot is this thing called convention over configuration. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how it translates into actual contributions and benefits for the programming of these web-based applications. And we'll also talk very, very briefly about some other patterns that are implemented by Spring Boot. And I won't really go into these in more detail. I'll just give you pointers to other places to learn about these patterns if you're interested in learning more. So one of the key patterns, it's more of a principle, I suppose, and a pattern, is called convention over configuration, which I find to be a very confusing phrase. Because as you'll see, there's actually tons of configuration that Spring does for you as well. So it makes it sound like we don't want to really do configuration, we just want to do convention. Convention trumps configuration. And that's not quite the way to look at it, but it's kind of what it looks like at first glance. What convention over configuration means is you want to create web apps. In this case, of course, you could apply the pattern to some other context too, like real-time embedded systems if you wanted, to provide a general reusable blueprint. So you want a blueprint that kind of says how things are created, what their syntax and semantics are, and what their dependencies and interrelationships are. That's what we mean by a blueprint in this context. And software frameworks that use this convention over configuration pattern, like Spring, benefit by decreasing the number of decisions that developers like us need to consider and apply when using the framework. So you want to be able to give people a lot of conventions that are going to get you 95% of the way there, but you want to leave opportunities for customization in order to make the framework appropriate for your particular use case. And we're going to talk about some examples in just a second. This way of doing things that Spring uses as its foundational pattern is also known as opinionated defaults configuration, which is why I think it's funny that they say convention over configuration, because configuration is super important. So if you take a look at this link, Spring Boot's opinionated strategy really basically says, we think we know the best way to design web applications. That's our opinion. We're opinionated. And so we're going to give you a bunch of capabilities and components and tools and annotations and so on and so forth that will do things the way we think they should be done. So by default, you get most of the stuff out of the box, which means there's a lot less you have to wrestle with. But, and here's the important but, you are able to customize and modify things where you need to. So opinionated gets you only so far, but then there's some things where you may disagree with their opinions, and they make it possible to make those changes in a systematic way, which is really cool. So let's take a look at some examples of this. So these are the things that they give you: reasonable defaults, only specify the unconventional bits, eliminate distractions, and reduce the number of decisions you have to make. Let's start with reasonable defaults. So the idea in Spring, or things that use this pattern, is if there's a class in the model part, the part that defines the data access layer or layers, called sales, then there should be a corresponding table in the database that's called sales by default. So that's a reasonable default. You have a class called sales, there should be a table called sales. Makes sense. Now, of course, you want to be able to do things that may deviate from that. So if you don't want the defaults, then they allow you to specify just the unconventional things, just the things that aren't what you're getting by default. So if for some strange reason that you want to call the table product sales instead of sales, there should be a convenient way to do that. And in Spring, there's a gazillion different ways to customize things typically through what are called annotations. So if you do need to deviate from the conventions, then you may need to write some code or just provide some declarative statements here and there that say, make this change. But you do it in a way that still follows the overall structure of the blueprint as much as possible. It's like when you buy a house or you build a house, there's typically a plan, but some of the things are left to your discretion as a house builder, like the colors of the rooms, or the finishes on the inside or outside of the house, or what type of windows to put in. But the overall plans may be highly reusable. Another goal is to eliminate distractions. So what might some of those be, you may ask? Well, one huge distraction in classic network systems are all the low-level, tedious, and error-prone details associated with programming networks. So opening sockets, encoding data, sending the data, multiplexing the data, taking the requests and mapping them to threads, all that kind of gobbledygook. Those kinds of things are really just done for you out of the box. You very rarely have to do much of anything other than use what comes out of the box. Having said that, of course, we'll see that there are ways of customizing different aspects of the networking details. For example, we'll see here in the next lesson, class or two, if you want to add a pool of connections instead of just having a connection for each request, that's very easy to do with Spring without changing much of your application. You just have to plop something into the right place, and then Spring will wire it up for you automatically. So rather than having to write everything in a low-level way, you can leverage declarative configuration mechanisms. Declarative in this context means we focus on the what, not the how. So the what would be like, I want to use this protocol, or I want to use this encoding model, JSON versus XML, for example. And rather than have to write all the code to do that, you just say, I want this or that, and Spring takes care of making that happen for you. Another good example of eliminating distractions is have the infrastructure, the Spring platform, manage the event loop or event loops using inversion of control. So you don't have to deal with the flow. You let the framework handle the flow for the bulk of the processing steps or stages. Yet another one of these convention over configuration style benefits is reducing the number of decisions that you have to make. So a really good example of this, and we'll see more examples, and if you watch Professor White's videos, he goes through this in more detail, is auto-wiring of fields to their implementations. And so unlike writing kind of classic Java code where you have to define factory methods and then explicitly call those factory methods to initialize your fields, in Spring, you can just define the field and say @AutoWired, which is an annotation, and then Spring will go and try to find the implementation of that particular field, and then it will create an instance of that and then wire the things together without you having to do that yourself. So that reduces the number of decisions you have to make. It lets the framework connect the pieces together. So in a sense, this is basically taking some of the patterns you're familiar with from the Gang of Four book and then codifying and automating them in the form of these annotation-based dependency injection mechanisms that we'll talk a lot about. So there's also lots of other patterns besides configuration over convention, and I won't go through them all right now, but here are some of them: broker, proxy, factory method, resource pool, component configurator, model view controller, and so on. And you can find information about these patterns in some of the classic literature that's out there. There's a nice book by a couple of colleagues of mine about enterprise integration patterns. A lot of what's in Spring follows along the patterns there. And there's other books that I've either co-authored or been involved with in one way or another that talk about many of these other patterns if you want to see the more fundamental nature of the concepts that underlie the Spring framework. OK, so that's the end of the overview of the software patterns we find in Spring Boot.